Okay, so today we're going to talk about sculpture. My last lecture on photography was a little bit more involved because I feel like with photography we're sort of familiar with the how of it, the what of it, and so I was going a little bit more into the form and the function. So in sculpture, I'm kind of returning back to more like the lectures on painting and printmaking and drawing, where I'm telling you more about how it's made and the different kinds of techniques associated with sculpture. So this will be a little shorter lecture, okay? And again, all of these, though you're probably watching it through Canvas, are available on my YouTube channel under the playlist for art appreciation. You can also go in to my YouTube playlist and watch art history lectures that correlate to different kinds of sculpture if you're interested in like minimalism or post-minimalism or something like that. That all exists and you're welcome to check that out. Okay, or just take Art History 2 with me and you'll learn lots of things like that. All right, so let's talk about sculpture. So there are a few basic categories of sculpture. The most basic categories are in the round and relief. Relief is a familiar word, right? Because when we were talking about printmaking, we talked about relief printmaking. Remember, that's where on the block that you've carved into, like for wood cutting, for example, the ink sits on top of the part that sticks up to make the print, the opposite of intaglio, where the ink sits down in the grooves. Okay, so we kind of know a little bit about what relief means, right? So let's look at in the round. So in the round sculpture means it's a freestanding work that can be viewed from any angle because it's finished on all sides. And when I hear sculpture, the first thing I think of is in the round sculpture. And I imagine it's probably the first thing you think of. So when someone says sculpture, I think a lot of us, the first instinct is to think of like carved marble, classic Greek sculptures of like Hercules doing something heroic, right? And he's all carved out of marble and you can go up to it and walk around and you can see him from the back, you can see him from the front and the sides. That's in the round. Okay, it doesn't have to be a human figure. In the round would also be, for those of you, you should all now have gone to the Springfield Art Museum. So the sculpture out in the front that sometimes is called the French fries, it's actually called Sun Target 2. That sculpture, you can walk all the way around it. So it's very abstract. It's a formalist sculpture. That is an example of sculpture in the round. Okay, so it's a freestanding thing that you can walk around. That's in the round. Relief sculpture is sculpture in which the forms project from but remain attached to a background surface. And within that, we have low relief or bas relief, which is a technique in which the figures project only a little bit. And then there's high relief sculpture, which has the forms that project out more boldly. So one of the kind of go-to example I have for this is when you think about like a Greek temple. I'm going back to the Greeks. We're going to use the Greeks as our examples here. So when you think of a Greek temple, you have all the columns, right? And then you have the kind of triangle part that's called the pediment up at the top. And in that pediment, you have like figures racing chariots with horses and things. So those are carved in and stick out. So you can see the figures kind of sticking out a little bit, but they're still attached, right? You couldn't walk around them. That's an example of usually low relief. Sometimes they're a little bit more high relief. And then my example for high relief that I go to is when you think about a Gothic cathedral, okay? Think about a Gothic cathedral and up at the top, sticking out, kind of leaning really far forward, you have gargoyles, right, that are sticking out, and sometimes they have a claw or a hand out, sometimes they have wings, and they're sticking off the building, but they're still attached into the buttress or into the wall. That's more high relief, okay? So those are kind of my go-to examples for low relief and high relief sculpture. So we have sculpture in the round, you can walk all the way around it. We have relief sculpture, it's attached, okay? Okay, so now we're going to go into the different sculptural methods or how we make these sculptures, which is kind of going back to what we were doing, talking about printmaking, talking about painting, that kind of thing. So our basic 4 categories are modeling, casting, carving, and assembling, okay? So here on the right, we have an example by one of my very favorite artists who I've mentioned in here before, I believe, Louise Bourgeois. She was born in France, but she lived in New York for most of her life, so we kind of get to claim her too. She's French-American artist. And this is one of her 30-foot tall spider sculptures called Mama. There is one of these very near here. This one's in Bilbao, Spain, at the Guggenheim Museum there. But another one of these, there's a series of these, also called Mama, is located about an hour and a half south of here at Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas. Highly recommend you go to that museum. It's a lovely museum, but they have one of these sculptures and they're really fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about our first category, modeling. So when I say modeling, I don't mean modeling like Heidi Klum. Do people still know who Heidi Klum is? I feel like she was a supermodel when I was young, and now she's a little more known as like the host of Making the Cut on Prime, for example. Before that, she was the host of Project Runway. So Heidi Klum is a supermodel. So when you hear modeling, maybe you think Heidi Klum. That is not what we mean when we're talking about in the art world or the sculpture world modeling. Modeling is an additive process. So for sculpture, the most common modeling material is clay. This branch of sculpture is called ceramics. And when wet clay, is being molded, being formed, being modeled, when it's wet and then it's fired, it's sometimes called terracotta, which is also a specific kind of clay. So you have terracotta, you have earthenware, you have stoneware, you have porcelain, you have raku. There's all different kinds of clay. But this branch of sculpture is generally called ceramics. So in terms of modeling, there are a couple different things you can do with clay. So you can also do a subtractive method called carving, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But in terms of modeling clay, what you're doing is taking a lump of clay and shaping it and then smushing it onto another form to create something else, okay? So like this sculpture that I have as an example here is by a artist named Woody D. Othello. He's kind of a up-and-coming, becoming a pretty famous contemporary artist. And so he makes these really kind of wonky, absurdist-looking sort of ceramic sculptures. They're quite large. And so he would have formed that main piece, right? And then he would have formed these little appendages that come off and stuck them on there, okay? So that's additive. When you're shaping something and then you're adding different pieces together to create the sculpture, that's additive, and that is what we call modeling, okay? So here's some tools that are associated with ceramic work. So therefore kind of associated with modeling. Here are a couple other examples. These are both by an artist named Jennifer Brandel. So these are both ceramic works. The one on the left that is black is porcelain. So this started as a wheel-thrown piece that was then altered. It was shaped and distorted, and then all that texture was added. And then on the right is a piece that is hand-built slab work, stoneware, ceramics on top. So all of those pieces were rolled out and then fitted together. And then on the bottom, it's a carved piece of wood, of redwood, I think. So those are both other examples of additive modeled sculpture. Casting. In contrast to modeling, casting seems like an indirect method. Metal, particularly bronze, we associate with casting, but you can also cast aluminum, you can cast iron. Metal is the material we most associate with casting. You can also cast other materials like plaster. You can cast slip, which is a form of ceramics. You can cast resin, which is a kind of plastic. You can cast all of those things. You can cast spam. You can cast butter. You can cast chocolate. You can cast all kinds of things. So with bronze casting, the metal is superheated until it flows like a liquid. It's super, super hot. It kind of looks like lava. It can then be poured into a mold. And on the next slide, we'll look at the lost wax casting method, which is one particular kind of casting. You can also do sand casting, which is mostly done with aluminum. There's a lot of different casting methods, but all of them, what they have in common is you have something in a liquid state. So if it's metal, it has to be heated. It is poured into a cavity or a mold, and then it cools or hardens, and then you take the mold away, or you pull it out of the cavity, in the case of sand casting, And then you have, in the substance that you poured to cast, you have the shape that was created by the mold. So here's an example by Emily Budd. She's a Las Vegas-based contemporary artist who does all kinds of casting. She also does all kinds of other metal work. She also does cast resins and plastics. Pretty fantastic artist. Look her up. Okay, so the lost wax method of casting I like to talk about because it's one of the oldest, maybe the oldest form of casting, and is also a very early form of sculpture, perhaps the earliest kind of metal sculpture. So what you do with this is you create a clay core, and then you use modeling, which we just talked about, in wax over the clay core. So you have like this basically space filler that's just clay, and then you do all the detail work by modeling, by carving, by adding on in wax. And then you attach to that wax form that you did over the clay core, you attach these wax rods, and you have metal pins that you drive into the core, and then you turn the whole thing upside down, and you add in all this clay, so you have your clay casting. The melted wax leaves an empty chamber, so everywhere where wax was is melted away, okay? And the pins kind of hold the core in place so that middle core stays spaced in underneath where the wax was, okay? The melted wax drains out. And then in place of the wax, you take your molten bronze or other metal, usually bronze, and you pour it into this clay form. And so everywhere where there was wax, there's now your metal. Okay, so when it cools, it hardens, and you have this metal creation. Then you just break all the clay off that you had around the outside to keep it, intact. So you break all the clay mold off, and then you have your metal left in the form of the modeled clay wax, the modeled wax that was over the clay. And then with the rods and stuff, which just creates the channel for the metal to go in, you just kind of cut those away and you sand them down, okay? And then you can also break out that ceramic core, the clay core, and just have a hollow cast metal. There's a few reasons for this. The most obvious one, right, is that metal's very expensive. Bronze is super expensive, so you don't want to spend all the money to have all of that bronze to make a solid form, right? The other reason is it's very, very heavy. So making something hollow has pretty obvious benefits for those reasons. So this is the lost wax form of casting, which is many thousands of years old and is still utilized today. Here's another very famous contemporary artist who uses casting. She does very large scale casting, which is pretty cool, and she does a lot of casting with concrete. This, I believe, is plaster, but she does concrete and plaster in her work. And so her name is Rachel Whiteread, and this is one of her works called Book Corridors from 1998. And you can see that she's made an imprint of all these books, basically, in like a library space or something like this. Okay, probably the most intuitive thing when we think of sculpture is carving. At least I think for a lot of people, carving is the first thing when you think of sculpting. So carving is more, whoops, that's a typo, sorry about that, isomer. That's supposed to say is more aggressive than modeling and more direct than casting, okay? So sculptures can be carved out of many substances, including wood and including stone. Those are the most common things that we think of when we think of carving, I think. Here's a piece by Henry Moore, who's a very famous modernist sculptor. And so this is one of his works that is carved out of African wonderstone. And here's some carving tools. So there's these are chisels and a hammer. So there's different kinds of chisels to get different kinds of textures. And there's different kinds of chisels that are used for stone and different kinds of chisels that are used for wood. So there's very particular kinds of tools that are used depending on what you're carving. There's also kind of electric automated, I don't exactly mean automated, but there's like power tools that are designed for carving that you can use for carving stone and for carving wood. You also then usually have sanding. There's usually some sandpaper and some sanding involved in carving. Okay, so that's carving. That was pretty intuitive. Then there's assemblage. So assembling is a process in which you have individual pieces or segments or objects, and they're brought together to form a sculpture. So oftentimes when I think of assemblage, I think of metal, right? Of taking pieces of metal and then welding them together. So they're connected together. Some things could be like found objects that are then glued together, or they're wired together, or they're adhered together with concrete or something. But welding metal together is my kind of where my brain goes when I think of assemblage. So this is, so it's kind of like modeling, right? It's kind of like bringing in these different pieces of clay and sticking them together to create something. But this is, you're using any kind of material. And this assemblage can apply to ceramics as well, but we generally think of metal or found objects more when we're talking about assemblage. So this example is by the modernist sculptor David Smith. This is Cubi 21, and it's made out of stainless steel that he has welded together. The last category I'm going to talk about is soft sculpture. So if you do go through and take Art History 2, soft sculpture really comes up in post-minimalism, which is one of my favorite periods of sculpture because I love this artist, Eva Hesse. She's one of my favorite artists. But soft sculpture is super interesting and ties into fiber arts, which sometimes we have a lecture on fiber arts in this class, and sometimes I don't. I kind of alter it a little bit semester to semester. So fiber arts is work that is textiles or things made out of fabric or paper and the associated techniques. Soft sculpture can fit as a category of fiber arts and also fits as a category of sculpture. So basically, this is sculpture that's made from fabric or other soft materials like, in this case, latex. This is made from rope and latex, and I think resin, maybe polyurethane, and it was made in 1970 by Eva Hesse. So soft sculpture, everything we've looked at so far becomes hard or is hard. So metal, wood, ceramics, all things that are hard. Soft sculpture is just making something three-dimensional that extends into space out of softer materials. Okay, so like sewing things together, sometimes you glue things together, sometimes you're doing casts, sometimes you're hanging things in this way, but it's all sculptural three-dimensional work that is then, rather than being made out of something hard, is made out of usually a fabric or latex or something like that. This is just another example. This is Bunny by Sarah Lucas. Sarah Lucas is a very famous contemporary artist. She's one of the YBA group. It's the Young British Artist group. They're not that young anymore. They're older than me, but that's still what the group is called. So Sarah Lucas does these soft sculpture pieces, whereas Eva Hesse is creating this material. Sarah Lucas kind of ties soft sculpture into assemblage, where she's taking some found materials like pantyhose and stuffing them and creating these kind of forms. Okay, so that is soft sculpture, and those are the basic kinds of sculpture. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to talking to you some more.